Okay, guys, this is going to be a very informal video. Don't really expect a script or any editing, but I'm just going to get straight to the point. This is a build on Lightning Sorceress, the Stormweaver Ascendancy in Path of Exile 2, using Arc as its main DPS skill for both mobbing and bossing. Just quick overview, we'll just go over gear recommendations, the passive tree, and gems for both leveling and endgame. And then some spliced footage at the end. Okay, so what is it good for? I know a lot of people are moving on from Cast on Shock because of the heavy nerf on December 12th. And this build is pretty flexible overall. It's more oriented towards bossing, but it can also handle mobbing pretty well, as you'll see in footage later in this video. The main DPS skill is called Arc. It's one of the first skills that you get pretty early on. The attack hits an initial target, and then it chains, doing less damage to subsequent targets. And if there are no more targets, then the leftover chains get turned into bonus damage, a more bonus damage multiplier. So whether or not you can chain it or not, the skill is pretty flexible overall. Weak points of the build is it struggles with really Zerg heavy mobbing due to the limitations on the number of chains on Arc. You could actually get Zerg down. You will probably encounter this at least a few times if you when you're starting mapping out and you run into Breach. That's a pretty tough one until you get strong enough where your Arc can self-sustain its own mana. For defensives, this build uses two main components, which is Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery. Mind Over Matter makes it so that all of the damage that you take will be directed to your MP before your health. So your MP essentially becomes part of your health. Eldritch Battery converts all of your energy shield into mana. And the reason why I'm running Stormweaver with it is two reasons. One is because Stormweaver has... Well, actually, the main reason of Stormweaver is because of Perma Arcane Surge and Arcane Surge based off of max mana scaling. And so because of that, we get a very powerful effect on Arcane Surge, which gives you additional cast speed and additional mana regeneration, which works very well with this build. There's other things that scale off of mana. You get additional spell damage from mana as well. And we also use the Archmage Spirit Gem, which gives additional or extra electric damage based off of your max MP. So basically, MP becomes your health pool, it becomes your cast speed, it becomes your mana regeneration, and it becomes your damage. So you could already imagine we focus a lot on mana as we get into the later parts of the build, but that's mainly at the later end. After you're done with the campaign, as you're heading into the 60s and 70s, you actually can't really run these early on because Mind Over Matter comes with a really heavy penalty, which is less mana recovery rate. This is not the same thing as mana regeneration rate. Mana recovery rate actually affects all sources of mana recovery in the entire game. And so that means this will affect your flask, which is pretty difficult to deal with. So you can't really afford to use Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery early on because you'll just never have enough MP. Later on, this could be easily mitigated with stuff from the passive tree, but also from equipment. But early on, you're mainly just going to be focusing on damage. And as you work your way up through the tree, you don't have to really pick up mana stuff, so you can ignore this. You're mainly moving through the tree, and then you want to keep heading up because the two earliest things that are very important are the two lightning branches at the top. You have one here and you have one here. In particular, this one is important because it adds one extra chain to Arc with these three nodes. Everything else is mainly damage. As you're working your way up here, you'll probably get into the 20s, and then when you get into the 20s, you should be able to unlock your Ascendancy, which is Stormweaver, and with your first 2 points, you should definitely invest into Arcane Surge, so you have that up all the time. It'll help you a lot during the campaign. You'll have additional cast speed, which is super helpful. and mana regeneration, so you have to spend less time with no MP. After that, you would work your way to the left. The reason why we go left here and not left here is because you pass by this elemental wheel, which you'll take later for lightning exposure. You could ignore this while you're leveling up because you don't have a way to apply lightning exposure until much later on. You'll also pass by these jewel slots, and these are extremely important, which you will utilize later, but while you're leveling, you could ignore them or just chuck whatever you get along the way. So you keep moving this way, this way, this way. As you pass through here, you'll pass by another elemental wheel. This one is quite good, as it comes with percent resistances and raw damage, and also shock magnitude. Shock magnitude, very important stat that we stack particularly later. Not super important early on. I wouldn't worry too much about it. What you're actually aiming for is this node right here. Touch the Arcane. This and the nodes preceding it improve the effect of Arcane Surge on you even further, which again will just help a lot with your sustain. And later on, you don't have to take this for a while. There's one more jewel node. It's just one node away, so you might as well take it because these nodes are especially powerful. And again, like I said, you're skipping. Don't worry about mind over matter while you're leveling. You're ignoring that. Same thing over here. These are low priority nodes as well. This is Eldritch Battery. You don't want to convert your energy shield to mana early on because you need that. Sorceress, very, very, very squishy as she's leveling up. It can be difficult to survive, and you need that energy shield. Arcane Intensity, you won't have a lot of mana early on, so especially without Eldritch Battery, so it's not worth taking early on. And raw mana, you don't really have a good way to sustain your mana early on. So basically, once you get to here, you can stop. You don't need to go here until later on. Same thing applies to these nodes. These are just for dependencies early on with gear. Once you get up to here, you just stop. You grab everything up here, and you don't keep going that way. This is mainly stuff related to power and magnitude and penetration. Need to clear the air on something before we continue, which is the distinction between penetration, exposure, and resistance reduction. PoE2, the penetration stat works differently. In PoE 1, penetration can go into the negatives, but PoE 2, it can't. And the proof behind that is if we hover over the tooltip, it actually says to a minimum of 0, as in it doesn't go beyond 0. On the other hand, there are two stats that can go beyond 0, which is exposure and reduction. Reduction is found on your curses, your hexes like conductivity, which is the main one you use, and this will pretty much reduce their resistance. It's not the same thing as penetrating through their resistance, it's reducing it. And exposure does the same thing. Exposure reduces their resistances, and these two can work in tandem and they can go beyond 0. What this essentially means is if you can reduce an enemy's resistance to 0 with exposure and your curse, before the penetration stat kicks in, the penetration stat actually does nothing. It literally does nothing at that point. And so you don't want to overstack too much on penetration because otherwise the only place where that's going to be helpful is map mods where enemies have bonus elemental resistances beyond what your exposure and your hex can handle normally. But we do grab the lightning pen in a few places, so you'll have some, and this will be especially useful for just general mobbing because you're not going to be casting conductivity on everything, especially with its extreme mana cost. Lastly, we have this section over here, which is one of the last sections, splitting to the right this way. You have the Hex branch, which we take once we start using Blasphemy to auto-apply conductivity. That way you don't have to cast your curse. It'll just be an aura that's always around you. More mana regeneration and shock magnitude, super important. Like I said, we'll touch into that later. And this is just raw damage because we need some raw damage to scale everything up with. There's also this branch over here, which is just bonus to your ability to inflict ailments. And inflicting ailment bonuses is way better than chance of applying shock because this also includes electrocute, which you won't be able to use early on unless you're very lucky, but later on electrocute will become your best friend and your most powerful survivability tool. You're also going to notice on my tree that there's a green line that runs this way, and also a red line that runs here. We're going to go over that later, but those are the weapon set points to reserve a spirit skill without actually having to spend the spirit to do it. All right, let's start with the weapon set lines. So basically, when you have leftover points, or when you have like 3 points, I'm going to actually respec here to demonstrate, because you'll get a better idea if I just show you rather than trying to explain it. So let me do that. Okay, so the weapon set points basically are skill points that apply specifically to the weapon set. It's self-explanatory, but it might be confusing. But basically, we have 6 skill points that we have unused right now. We're going to use 6 skill points in one way for weapon set 1, and then use the same 6 skill points in a different way for weapon set 2. So if I click this button here, I am now currently only allocating these 6 skill points I have for weapon set 1. And it's indicated by this red line. So now when I'm in weapon set 1, it's using these nodes, and weapon set 1 is my main damage setup. Now if I click on weapon set 2, I have 6 points to work with here as well. And the reason why I'm allocating strength here is because that CDR shield that I'm using requires 30 strength. And so if I apply these points for strength, well, it won't mess with my main setup. My main setup is still using all damage and int. My secondary setup, which is used for quick mobility, and I'm not doing damage during it, can have the strength needed to equip the shield. And now I fill out the prerequisites for the shield only when I'm blinking. And when I'm not blinking and doing damage, I don't need the strength, so I'm not using it. So it's a very interesting and flexible way to customize your build further. The jewel slots are extremely important. There are 6 stats that are useful, but 2 of them are very important. Those 2 important stats are magnitude of shock inflicted and recover mana on kill. The recover mana on kill is what will allow you to sustain your mana as you are mapping. All you need to do is clear out 1 pack of mobs with your arc, and it will pretty much refill your mana, and your mana is your HP. Therefore, having this is basically life on kill in percentage. So grabbing this on a few jewels will allow you to sustain mana even with these absurd mana costs. Magnitude of shock is a percent scalar to your shock debuff, and we get to apply 2 shocks because of being a Stormweaver. And so the stronger we make our shock, the more it's going to amplify our damage overall. Spell damage and cast speed are both good, but they're additive. Cast speed in particular is quite good because, again, we want to cast as quickly as possible before mana costs ramp up. Increased area of effect on curses is also very useful because it will allow you to apply your curse from further away with blasphemy without having to get too close. And increased curse effect is also a very useful line as well, as it'll make your curse reduce more lightning resistance. And remember, because it's a curse and not pen, it does go below 0%. So those are the 6. Only 2 of them are very important. But if you can only have 1, if you can only afford 1, it's recovered 2% of mana on kill. That is the quintessential jewel socket line, and what will single-handedly actually help you maintain your MP while mapping and keep you alive. You have a total of 4 jewel slots to work with in the current configuration that I have up to level 85 or so. So that's an overview. I don't have the rest of it because I have been making this tree up as I go along. It might not be super optimal, but it's been what's working well for me. I literally planned this out 30 minutes before the server opened, and I changed it a lot along the way. Next, we're going to go over the gems. And there's only a handful of gems that we actually need. We have Arc, Orb of Storms, Mana Tempest, Blasphemy, Archmage, and Blink. These three you're not going to be using early on. They will come much later on as you're finishing the campaign on Cruel. Early on, you'll actually most likely be using either Arctic Shield or Cast on Spark just to use your spirit on something. Arctic Shield particularly good because you can run Clarity with it, which can help with your mana sustain early on if you're having issues with mana. Cast on Shock if you have nothing else better to do because it's just free damage that'll proc once in a while. You don't have to worry about anything up here. You can put gems on them, and they do have some practical applications, especially mana drain later on as a way to sustain mana during downtime. But starting with Arc, this is your main DPS tool. And the gems that I use on all the links is Considered Casting. This increases its damage, lowers its cast speed. Lightning Mastery, which is a very late game gem. This is a level 3 gem, so you won't use it early on. Controlled Destruction, which completely removes its ability to crit, but it gives you 30% more damage. And that is what we're basically planning around. And if you notice during the passive tree, I didn't pass over any spell crit nodes. Lightning Penetration, which again, remember what I said about exposure and elemental reduction. We use Lightning Pen anyways because we are not casting conductivity on everything. So having a little bit of Lightning Pen is still useful. You can see that even though I didn't focus on Lightning Pen, we still have 60% with everything all considered. And lastly, Chain. And Chain is a bit of a... There is a caveat related with Chain. So what Chain does is it cuts the damage of the spell in half, adds 1 chain to it, and then doubles that amount of chains after the fact. So let's say you have a low-level arc that chains 3 times. It would add 1, turning that to 4, and then double it to 8. And Chain, as I explained at the beginning, it does extra damage for every unused chain that you have left over. So what does this mean? It means that at low levels, if you use Chain, you will lose 50% of its damage for using Chain, and at best get 50% more damage additive with the leftover chains against single target, which would mean, and what that boils down to is Chain is a noob trap. Early on, it's a noob trap, and later on, it becomes the most powerful support gem that you could use on the skill. So what this means is don't use Chain early on, because you're not going to gain damage for doing it. There's 2 problems with using Chain early on, besides for the fact that it won't increase your damage against single target. It will split your damage too much against mobs of enemies, and the issue with that is it will lower your TTK too much against mobs of enemies, and they're going to all run at you and beat the daylights out of you, and you have no mitigation early on as a lightning sork. So it's much better to have the full damage of Chain early on and kill a few enemies at a time so that you can better handle mobs and packs of enemies while leveling. And so when you only have 2 of the nodes available, I recommend Considered Casting and Controlled Destruction, or Controlled Destruction and Unleash. I don't have Unleash on here, but Unleash is a pretty good gem. What Unleash does is it will make it so that if you don't cast nonstop, your skill will build up to 2 stacks, and for every stack that you have, it does an extra cast that's 50% of the potency, and that's pretty good for Arc, because remember, you're not nonstop mobbing. You're going to occasionally, be as you travel from pack to pack of enemy, you're going to be building these stacks. So your first Arc that you throw as you're approaching a new pack will be fully empowered, and it's really quick to build up the stacks. The reason why we don't use Unleash later on, though, is because Unleash has a 140% mana cost multiplier, which is prohibitively expensive in the later parts of the game. So most of these support gems that we use do not increase the mana cost, with the exception of Lightning Pen, which is the sole one that raises it to 120%. So early on, Unleash, great option. Early mapping, still probably a great option. By the time you get to really late game and you're really geared up and your spells are really high level and they cost a lot of mana, we're trying to avoid those mana multipliers on Arc so that we can spam cast it. Because remember, you don't want the costs to get too high because your mana is your life. That's what's protecting you and keeping you alive. And Arc itself, it gains additional damage, but also chains as you go from level to level. And if you take a look at this website, this is the PoE2 database. They have data mine information. I don't know how popular of a resource this is, but we can look at Arc here and we can see the level, the int requirements, the mana costs, the damage minimum to maximum, and the number of chains per level. And you can see that there are important level breakpoints at 6, 13, 20, 29, and 33. And these are the levels at which the chain amount increases. Later on, this is important because when you do get to a point where you could use chain as a support gem, it doesn't increase by 1, it'll increase by 2. And usually the point at which chain will become worth it as a support gem is when your skill reaches level 20 and reaches the 5th chain. On top of that, something that's really important to know is that damage gains by gem leveling is exponential, not linear. And so the more levels you pump into a skill, the more exponential the damage becomes with it. And so early on, it's not too important to grab spell levels. It's definitely a nice to have, especially if it gets you to an extra chain. But as you're getting into mid to late mapping, you need to prioritize getting spell levels on your weapons and your amulet so that you could reach at least level 29 on your arc and just get the strongest amount of damage. But again, just remember, as you are gaining levels, the mana cost goes up. From 26 to 29 is only 3 levels, but it increases both the damage and the mana cost by 50% in just 3 levels. We'll go over gear a little bit more in depth after we talk about the gems. And remember, when it comes to gems, the number of colored gems you use correspond to main stat. So we take int mainly because int gives us MP, and remember, MP scales everything on this build, but you will need a little bit of strength and dexterity so that you can equip certain gems, which I think are very important for the build. Remember, lightning pen and chain, these come later, but they're dexterity gems, so you'll need a little bit of dexterity. If you can get the stats on your gear, then that's good too. You don't have to grab it on the passive tree. Orb of Storms is kind of there as a remote installation. You just place it on top of yourself, and it helps deal with enemies that zerg on top of you since we have limited mobility. And for that, we have Conduction and Lightning Exposure and Strip Away. Lightning Exposure and Strip Away work together to apply your exposure stat, which you amp up through your passive tree. But early on, you won't have these two. So just Conduction is fine. And you can just put whatever you want, like AoE size or whatever, in the other gem slot. Oh, sorry, before we continue, I should also talk about quality. And this is also very important because as of recording this video, there is a strategy that is going around, which is Vaal orbing the skills that you use. And this can be an okay early solution to getting to a 6-link skill. But I strongly recommend against this if you are planning on using the skill long term. It's only a short-term advantage. The reason for that is when you Vaal a skill, it corrupts the skill, and any item that is corrupted in Path of Exile can no longer be modified. You can't do anything to change the skill beyond that, besides for, in the case of skill, like spells, you can level them up still, but you won't be able to change the quality, and the quality is very important. Quality comes from using GCPs on the skills, which is a currency you'll get later. They're called Glass Cutter Prisms, and when you use a GCP on a skill, it'll raise its quality by 5%, and quality maxes out at 20%. So as you can imagine, you need 4 GCPs to max out an item's quality. Quality can go higher than 20%, but as far as like what's normal and what most people have, 20% is par for the course. Quality can go higher with Vaal if you hit that randomly. The reason why quality is so important is because every skill operates a little bit differently when you add quality to it. In the case of Arc, it gains more damage for each remaining chain, up to 5% additive to the more multiplier. And so instead of 10% more damage for each remaining chain. It goes all the way up to 15% more damage for each remaining chain. And that might not sound that impressive, but remember, more damage is its own multiplier, and a very powerful one at that. And late game, there are a lot of extra chains that you can have. In fact, my arc here has 16 chains. So against a single target enemy, that is 15% times 15 extra chains. And that's the more multiplier against a single target enemy. It's extremely powerful. And so, like, while it's okay to Vaal for sockets early on, your late game arc, you're going to need... you need to have it at 20 quality. And the thing is, GCPs aren't that expensive, especially at the time of recording this, because a lot of people don't know about quality. They simply don't. And a lot of people are running around with 0 quality, and GCPs are actually kind of undervalued at this time. And so it's pretty cheap to raise the quality to 20, and it's just such a massive damage increase. This varies, of course, from build to build and from skill to skill. Not all skills have an impressive effect with quality. For example, my Orb of Storms has no quality on it. It's not very important. My Mana Tempest, the effect on it, on raising the quality on this, very unimportant. Blasphemy, quite important, and I'll get to why we raise the quality on this. Blasphemy is a spirit skill, so it's toggled using reserves of spirit. That normally belongs to Witch, but we take it. And then Archmage, you have to raise the quality on this one because it gives you additional extra damage based off of your mana. So this is an important one to raise. And then Blink, not that important to raise the quality on as well. As far as gem sockets go as well, the only one that's really important to reach maximum sockets on is Arc. Orb of Storms is perfectly fine at 3. I don't feel the need to go any higher than this. Mana Tempest, perfectly fine at 2. Don't need to go higher than this. Blasphemy, frankly speaking, probably fine at 2. You probably don't need to. Lesser Jewelers, this either. You can get away with 2. Archmage doesn't use any gem at all, funny enough. And then Blink, we take things that increases cast speed and its cooldown recovery rate. I'll explain why when we get to covering how you get to utilize Blink. But the rest of the abilities, Mana Tempest, this skill is... This is your big juicer skill. This makes you do tremendous damage. So much so that most of the time you will not be using Mana Tempest. And the reason why is it's complete overkill. It's just beyond overkill for regular mobbing. This is your boss killing tool. And what it does is while you are inside Mana Tempest, it'll constantly drain MP from you, and any skill that you use while in it is hugely empowered. And so you can see in the tooltip here at level 28, any skill that I cast while inside Mana Tempest gains 94% damage as extra lightning damage. And also, it gives you additional chains as well. And this amount of chains is also empowered. So it makes your arc just do ridiculous damage. Now, the reason why we can't use it is because it's not without its drawback. What Mana Tempest does is, even though the amount of mana it drains from you is really small, the amount that it drains will scale based off of how much MP you've currently used while inside it. So right now, you see my MP isn't moving. If I cast Arc once... it's kind of recovering, right? But you see it's slowly lowering. Now it's rapidly lowering. It's super rapidly lowering. The more MP that I use while I'm in Mana Tempest, the more MP it's eating. It eats more and more MP the more you feed into it. And so if I were to cast this a couple of times, you could see that my mana will not survive. And your mana, once again, is your HP. And so if you're not careful, you can easily run out of mana, and now you have nothing to protect your HP with. So it's kind of a delicate balancing act of not using too much mana so that you don't make yourself too vulnerable. That being said, the whole other bit is because your mana is your HP, if you get hit too much and you run out of mana because it was protecting you, now you can't cast. And if you can't cast, you can't kill the thing. And if you can't kill the thing is going to keep killing you until eventually you die. And that's a problem that running Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery can actually cause for people when they first start using it, is they get hit a couple times and then they can't protect themselves and they just die because they're just out of mana perpetually. So you have to be kind of careful and just learn that balancing act. And what you can learn to do with Mana Tempest is you can cast it, and before the mana drain gets out of hand, you just step out of it. Get 1 or 2 casts in while inside the Mana Tempest, and then get out. Here's why. Mana Tempest has like a 1 second cooldown. Yeah, it's literally a 1 second cooldown and a 0.3 second cast time with my cast speed. And so it's very easy to just cast it, step out, cast it, step out, and you can keep doing that to empower your attacks without incurring too much of a mana drain. For that reason, I assign it to a mouse button, so it's just easy to cast and move, cast and move, cast and move. Your spirit skills, like I mentioned before, Arctic Shield is good to take early on when you don't have access to some of these other ones. You really don't have access to a good spirit skill until you get to Archmage, and Archmage becomes available all the way at level 14 spirit gems, which is at the end of the campaign as you're approaching into the 60s, 70s. But Blasphemy, it's a meta gem. You chuck other gems into it, and then it passively applies the effect. For Blasphemy specifically, it will automatically apply a curse as an aura around you. And then after that, we take increased area of effect on curses so that the aura is larger, so that you don't have to be immediately next to an enemy to curse them. Again, as you check the footage later, you'll see that I don't have to apply curses to any enemies. They'll just automatically be cursed as they come closer to me. And this is great for passive, lazy gameplay. I love lazy gameplay. I love comfortable gameplay, and this is like the pinnacle of it. Instead of having to apply curses to everything that you pass by, it's all just cursed for you. And also, you know, it's just too much of a nuisance to apply curse because the mana cost of curses is just extremely high. It's super, super high, and you don't want to be casting that all the time, especially casting conductivity after you make Mana Tempest. That mana cost is factored into Mana Tempest and speeds up the drain. So if you do it like that, your mana will just evaporate really quickly. So you need to be careful with how you use your curse conductivity prior to putting it on Blasphemy. Archmage, this is one of our main damage scalers. Every 100 max mana you have, you get additional, or you get extra lightning damage. So at this level, it's 8% for every 100 mana I have 3,200 mana, so 8% times 32 extra electric damage, just passively applied at all times. However, the drawback to using Archmage is that your non-channeling spells will cost an extra 5.1% of your maximum mana on every cast. So you can see my Arc has a stupidly high mana cost at 514. When you first get Archmage, you're going to notice that it's especially difficult to maintain your MP pools just because all of your skills just take way too much mana. Lastly, there's Blink. Blink is a mobility skill that's pretty much exclusive to intelligence-based classes, and it's very, 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 very nice to have. Mobility skills, everyone gets one in Path of Exile 1, but in PoE 2, most classes don't have access to a mobility skill, let alone one that's this fast and this good. And so usually there's a trade-off involved in using Blink because it eats up your spirit reservoir, and we have a very finite amount of spirit. We want to use it with Archmage and Blasphemy so that, you know, we can do the most amount of damage. So taking a mobility seems like it's using up space. Well, you can use weapon swapping to basically use Blink without having to reserve that spirit. I actually learned this from chat, but I saw a video this morning from a Path of Exile player named Tuna. I'll link his video down in the description below somewhere. But he basically found out that this shield exists, and this shield has 50% increased cooldown recovery rate. And so he is using that in his weapon swap setup and using it to switch to that weapon set. And that 50% cooldown recovery rate will apply to Blink. Blink normally has like a 3-second cooldown or so. So with this shield equipped, you can bring that cooldown down to 1.5 seconds or so. And so you just have this mobility skill that's great for getting around maps. You can jump gaps with it, which is extremely helpful while mapping. That's, again, a luxury that many people had in PoE 1 that you have access to in PoE 2. So how do you actually set this up? So right now I have Blasphemy, Archmage, and Blink in my skill setup. And if you click on the right arrow here, you're going to see these two boxes in the bottom right. One is for weapon set 1, and the other one is for weapon set 2. And what this basically is saying is, I want to use this skill with weapon set 1, or I want to use the skill with weapon set 2, or I'm fine with using it with both. And for weapon set 2, I pretty much just put a cast speed and the shield in weapon set 2, and this is my main weapon set for just DPSing. So everything that's involved in my regular gameplay and dealing damage, I tick off weapon set 1. For Blasphemy, I have both of them ticked off because sometimes as I'm blinking away, I'm doing damage. So I want to make sure that Blasphemy is still applied. Blasphemy also has a small delay on reapplying a curse if the enemy's out of range or you're turning it on or turning it off. So it's better to just keep Blasphemy on at all times so the curse is always applied. Archmage, we only have it for weapon set 1, and then Blink, we only have it for weapon set 2. And so what'll happen now is I'm going to switch to weapon set 2. This one does like no damage. If I blink and then use any of my normal damage skills, I'm just going to press Q without pressing the weapon swap. The character automatically switches to that weapon set. It's all seamless. It's all one button press. So what you can essentially learn is you can learn this habit of weapon swapping, space barring, and then you can just use your regular attacks and your character will just attack normally. It's just one quick smooth motion, one extra input, but it will allow you to basically blink, and then when you're ready to fight, you drop blink and you switch to Archmage and Blasphemy. That way, we can use 3 spirit skills with just a spirit pool of just 160, whereas normally doing this would take 220. Now, the people that know items a little bit better might be wondering how I am actually getting enough spirit in the first place, especially if my top only has 55 spirit and my necklace has 0 spirit. If it takes 160, how can 155 accomplish this? And you can see in my spirit, I have 155. The answer, once again, comes down to quality. Blasphemy is one of the few abilities in the entire game that gets a reservation reduction with quality. And so the chess piece, it only maxes out at around 54, 55, 56 spirit or so. That's like around the highest roll that you can get. So you can't get 60 spirit normally on the chess piece, or at least I haven't seen it on PoE Trade. But by raising the quality of Blasphemy, we can reserve enough spirit with the chess piece alone without having to go in, like, without having to get spirit on the necklace. Why this is important is because what you want on the necklace ultimately is level of all spell skills. And that is a super premium stat for the necklace. So to get both spirit and that on a necklace would cost an insane amount of exalts. And so by not having to get spirit at all on the necklace, we can lower the cost of the necklace considerably and get those valuable spell skill levels, because remember what I said, spell skill levels are exponential. It's just really goddamn important that you get it on your necklace eventually, if not sooner than later, of course. Other stats, we're just going to quickly go over each of the slots. Your weapon, extra damage as elemental damage is always welcome. Mana is always welcome because mana gets converted into everything. Intelligence is always welcome because intelligence, one, you're going to need some of it so that you can learn the higher level skills, the intelligence requirement, because we sometimes don't get enough intelligence through the tree, especially if we have to allocate some of the points to strength or dexterity. And then also it converts into MP. Every one intelligence gives you 2 MP. And that's all going to go into your mana pool and then scale out to damage, CDR, regeneration, etc. And then on the weapon, there is bonus skill levels. I'm going to take this as a bit of a tangent because some people may be wondering, should you use a staff or should you use a wand and a focus? The answer for this particular build is universally wand and focus. Staff is just straight up inferior, not an opinion. It's objectively inferior. The reason is simple. The focus can get energy shield, and energy shield gets converted into mana. The staff cannot, just simply put. My focus gives 258, and so that's 2 to 3 extra scales off of the passive tree node that gives you spell damage, Archmage, and then just a ton of extra arcane surge scaling as well. And then offensively, they're gonna be roughly the same as well. I have a deadline, the critical hit chance. We don't want anything crit related because we're not critting. And gaining MP or gaining mana on enemy killed is a extremely underrated and extremely powerful stat for this build. We're going to be stacking a lot of it, but you don't have to go out of your way to get it on your items. But if it's there, it's a good line. Do not sleep on this line. If you see it, it's not bad at all. You should be happy to see it, but don't go out of your way for it either. More damage is better. And our biggest damage scaling stat ultimately in all of our gear setup is going to be cast speed. For the rings, there's lightning damage, which is okay. It's additive, so it's not super important. Mana, I've already gone over. Life is fine to have. It's not super premium for this class. Most classes value life a lot. It's just nice to have because in case you do screw up, you do want some HP as like a last ditch survival. All elemental resistance. Every PoE player knows this, but if you're not a PoE 1 player, capping out your resistances is very, very important. Enemies do a lot of damage at the end game, and it's one of the only ways that we can actually mitigate damage as a sorceress. You'll see that I actually have 0 armor and 0 evasion, which means that every attack that comes our way is going to hit us. It will hit us. And so any mitigation that you can get, you should take it. It's quite important. Helmet, there's nothing super important here. It's just resistance and energy shield. Get as much as you can. Same thing with the top. I got a really good top. This one, there are runes that you can get that increase armor, evasion, and energy shield. And if your item has a very high base of energy shield, you should use these runes if you can over resistance runes. Because remember, MP is everything to us. It scales everything. And energy shield is MP. So for this top, for example, one might wonder, why didn't you just use a lightning rune or all res and cap out your resistances or chaos resistance runes? It's because the base of this top is just so much energy shield. We want to scale it with that 40% energy shield increase with these runes just to push our mana as much as possible, because that is also going to increase our survivability, but that's also going to increase our damage, speed, everything. The necklace, I already went over, but basically the most important thing is to get spell levels on this. If you can get resistances on it, cool. Later on, you'll also have to anoint a notable on it as well. And I'll quickly go over that. Basically, in the end game, there's a system called Delirium. Delirium is one of the map contents. And when you do Delirium, you're going to get special items called Distilled Emotions. And every single notable in the game, if you hover over it and press Alt, you'll see Distilled Emotions and then 3 words. And that is a combination. That is a combo of 3 currencies that specifically come from Delirium. If we go and grab some of those currencies, I can show you just so you can see what I mean. These currencies can be used to open up this menu, which you can place your item in. You can it takes the necklace, or it also takes maps. You can put maps in here, and you can use these emotions in here, and they will buff up the map and make them delirium based as well. And so that's another thing you can do with them if you have excess. But for the gearing, the combination of distilled emotions allows you to put a notable on the passive tree directly onto your necklace. And that means that anything, anywhere on the necklace, you can take one of them, and if you have the right combination, you can slap it right onto your necklace. Now, the very best one in the entire passive tree is something called Lightning Rod, and Lightning Rod makes all of your lightning damage lucky. Lightning damage has the highest skew between minimum and maximum, but lucky, what it does is it rolls the damage twice, and it takes the higher of the two, so it helps average out your damage closer to the middle skew. The problem with this is that Lightning Rod asks for suffering, isolation, and isolation, the 2 rarest currencies from Delirium. At this time, 1 suffering costs over 50 exalts, and there's not even isolations in circulation, and isolations are even rarer than suffering, and you need 2 of them. And so realistically, if you wanted Lightning Rod on your amulet, you're looking at something that costs hundreds of exalts. So that's not really an option. What is an option, on the other hand, is this one, which I actually quite like a lot, called Conservative Casting. This one uses Disgust, Disgust, and Ire. And this combination gives you 20% mana regeneration rate, which is whatever. But more importantly, it gives 8% reduced mana cost of skills, which is very important because not only is that reducing the cost of your arc, but it's also reducing the cost of your mana Tempest and the speed at which it scales. So this is pretty cheap to get. Disgust isn't that cheap. It's still it's still a few exalts, but it's the most accessible of the good notables that you can grab that will actually help you out and help out your comfort. There's other options as well, but Conservative Casting is just one that I recommend that I think will make your life, especially in early mapping, just a lot simpler. Also, we didn't talk about the other ascendancies. We're just going to circle back for a second to talk about the other ascendancies. At this time, only 6 points are available. The 7th and 8th point are not currently available. The furthest players ahead have not unlocked them yet, so we are just playing with 6. When you get 2 more points after Arcane Surge, you can grab Strike Twice in Act 3 of normal mode, and then when you get to Cruel, and you get the last points from the 3rd trial, you can grab Force of Will. It actually doesn't really matter which one you pick first. Strike Twice will allow you to put 2 shock stacks on an enemy, but the shock stacks have less duration, 50% less duration. And so, you have to keep reapplying shock or else the stacks fall off. But having double shocks on the enemy is extremely powerful, especially with all the magnitude that we grab later. You can make the boss essentially take double damage while both shocks are active. I think at this time, my shocks are 47%. And so with 2 of them on, the boss is taking 94% more damage. Force of Will is one of the mana scalers, and so it's especially good after you get Eldritch Battery and convert all your energy shield into MP. It will increase the effect of Arcane Surge by 1% for every 15 mana you have. We raised mana with everything, and so every 1% more, you get more cast speed and you get more mana regeneration rate. So the more mana you have, the faster you cast, and the more mana you get as well. And that's on top of this, that's additive with Touch the Arcane over here. So you'll have just a really powerful Arcane Surge that is active at all times. And that's going to help a lot because especially in Mana Tempest, we want fast cast speed because the longer time we spend in Mana Tempest, the more Mana Tempest is feedback looping into itself to cost more. So faster cast speed increases your survivability, less animation lock, and more burst out before the mana costs become unbearable. Okay, we're going to get to the gloves. And the gloves, this is the only item which I will say is 100% mandatory for this build. As in, if you don't use this item, I can't even recommend playing this build. It's called Kitoko's Current. And what it does is any lightning damage you do will build up electrocution, which is different than shock. Shock makes an enemy take more damage. Electrocution is a hard CC. if you're coming from this video from Frost Sork, you know that your freeze would freeze an enemy for 4 seconds. Electrocution applies arguably easier than that, and it's a hard CC that lasts for 5 seconds. And it works on bosses as well. And so this is going to basically lock down enemies in place when you're mapping. Your chain will just electrocute everything. Nothing will be able to move, and you'll be able to kill them really easily. And when you're bossing, you just have to use Arc a few times, electrocute them, and then full dump your burst with Mana Tempest. You'll see that in the footage later. This is 100% mandatory. The stats itself on it are not that good. You want to get the minimum amount of reduced attack speed and cast speed. So 10% is best, 15% is worst. It is possible to corrupt it lower than 10%, but those cost a premium. The belt is just the belt. There's a lot of things that you can grab here. You're mainly getting resists, but life is good. Mana is good. Mana increased from flasks is good as well. That's a solid one. Reduced charges on flask, that is also a good one. It just means you'll be able to use your flask more in an elongated battle before you run out. And also armor is fine. Armor is fine as a line. Armor is fine as an implicit. Both are okay. Both will allow you to reduce some incoming physical damage, which is pretty much the bane of our existence, ranged physical damage, because we can't avoid it and we have no resistances for it, so it'll chunk your health the most. So armor is also a solid option here. Boots, there's nothing special here. You just want movement speed. Movement speed goes up to 30%. I just settled for 25% because 30% just costs way too much, and just grab the resistances that you need. The focus, which is the other weapon, is counter to the wand. With the staff, the staff occupies both hands. With the focus, this is basically your magic shield. You want to get anything that increases the energy shield. So increased energy shield and maximum energy shield is good. Spell damage is fine. It's additive. Lightning damage is fine. Level of all spell skills is necessary, mandatory, and it goes up to 2. So you get 2 here and you get 4 here. That adds up to 6. Staff goes up to 6 as well, so they're equivalent. And then after that, resistances are fine, intelligence is fine, mana is fine, the same stuff as usual. Flask, I think it's good to just get instant recovery here because you will only use it in a dime in an emergency when you're getting bursted. Mana Flask, the problem is because of Mind over Mana, the Mana Flask is nerfed. It's a really small amount. 329 over 1.8 seconds is very low compared to 3,200 mana. And so you want to get increased recovery rate and reduced charges per use just so you get the most amount of uses from it. And if you're not a PoE 1 player, you need to get in the habit of regularly pressing this button as you are playing, because as you kill enemies, you get back charges and you're able to just keep using it. There's no point in holding it if you're going to be getting more of it as you're mapping. So just get in the habit of pressing your mana potion as you're mapping. Lastly, there is the charm. And I like to just keep all the different charms that are actually relevant and dangerous in my inventory so I can swap them around as needed. But the 3 most important ones are the Antidote Charm, the Freeze Charm, and the Stun Charm. The Bleed Charm is also okay as well, the Staunching one. It's very similar to the Antidote Charm, but if you're in a map where any of these 3 are particularly prevalent, just switch to that charm. It'll save you. It'll basically dispel that effect if it hits you automatically. It's just like a free get out of jail trinket. The Stun one is the Flinch, and you're gonna get flinched a lot. You have no energy shield, you have low HP, basically most attacks will flinch you, and if you get stun locked, if you don't react instantly, you're just going to get locked down and killed. So the stun one is good when there's no other like major negative effects in application. I have it on at all times. The one effect that I think is actually quite useful on it is guard during effect, which gives you a little shield over your mana whenever it procs. I like that effect personally. But it really, you can take anything on here as long as you have them in your inventory. Anyways, that's pretty much going to cover the build. I'll put some B-roll of just some gameplay footage stitched at the end of this. And by me, I mean my editor. Eve, yeah, I'm signing you up for this. And if you have any questions about the build, you can post in the comments. And I will try to answer them.